Namaste. Welcome all to Candid Convos, podcast series of LeadFac Solutions. In the inaugural session, we are privileged to have Rebecca Sutherns with us. Rebecca is a CPF master from International Association of Facilitators. She is also a certified coach from ICF and professional level adaptability quotient coach. Rebecca holds a PhD in sustainable communities. She is a facilitator at heart. She has been coaching senior executives, leaders, and board of directors in Canada as well as across the globe for the past 25 years for various reputed organizations. Rebecca is also the most sought after and a terrific keynote speaker and has been positively impacting the lives of tens of thousands of people with her wisdom, and it's counting. She is also an author. She has authored three books till now: Elastic, Nimble, and Sightline. She is currently heading Sage Solutions. It's a strategy consulting company. And in this podcast, we are going to discuss about her book, Nimble, that she has written about process facilitation. And you can know more about Rebecca from her website, RebeccaSutherns.com. So it's a pleasure and privilege to have you with us, Rebecca. Thank you very much for kindly agreeing to be with us.
I appreciate the conversation, Ramesh. Thank you.
Sure. So we'll slightly, directly get into that. See, you're talking about, being nimble, especially for facilitators. See, why being nimble is so important for process facilitators.
It's funny because I originally wrote the book Nimble right before the global pandemic, and I didn't know at that time, obviously, how important the concept of nimble was going to become for everybody. But
Right.
when I first wrote it, I did write it for facilitators, and I wrote it for a particular reason. I was finding that when I had looked for facilitation training or books prior to that, it seemed that they focused really heavily on process design, on techniques, but they really didn't talk a lot about what happens when what happens in the room is different than what you planned. And my feeling is that it should be different than what you planned. I feel like it should be responsive to the actual live humans in the room and shaped by that dynamic. And so I was encountering some facilitators who were feeling that somehow they had done something wrong if a session didn't follow their script. And on the other hand, there are also some folks who just weren't planning scripts at all in some ways. They had no kind of plan heading into a meeting. They would just show up and expect that by having a list of topics to discuss on an agenda that somehow the meeting would go well. And so it occurred to me that there were kind of two pitfalls really for people who are either overly scripted or not scripted enough. And really what I was craving was giving some thought to what it means to be able to flex with both of those styles and really be responsive to whatever happens in the room. And so the book came out of that desire to help facilitators be more attentive and responsive rather than being over or under prepared.
Great. No, in fact, you start your book with a very nice, punchline. Everyone has a plan until they get, punched in the mouth. That is, the boxer's quote. That's what, you started the book. That's very apt. See, I would like to read a quote from the book. You says, within quotes, going off script, that is deviating from the plan, is not necessarily an indication of inadequate preparation or shortcoming on the part of the facilitator. Rather, it is an indication of stellar performance. Very interesting perspective, Rebecca. Can you please elaborate on this?
It's interesting, having now, been working on this material for the years since the book was published, seeing which parts of it still have a lot of traction for me. And even just yesterday, I was training a group in planning retreats and meetings, and we were talking about this exact thing. We were saying, being confident enough in the tools that you have and in your judgment from the front of the room enough that you can, you can be willing to loosen your grip on your script and go with what seems to be needed in the room is a sign of facilitation skill and maturity. And I think sometimes we assume that our comfortable kind of happy place in terms of our style is shared by everyone in the room, and that just isn't true. And so what I sometimes do is I ask people, if you are a very detailed, orchestrated, scripted kind of person, and you have a meeting being led by someone who is more spontaneous, more improvisational, how does that feel for you as a participant? And inevitably they talk about it being like out of control, chaotic, purposeless, right? They talk about negative words. And if I flip that and say, if you are an improvisational person being facilitated by a highly scripted person, how does it feel for you? And they often will use words like rigid, suffocating, no room for my input, and so sometimes we forget that where we like to be, and in fact, where we gravitate to, especially under stress, may not be the preferred style of everyone in the room. And so if we as facilitators can kind of flex with that, and I talk about there being kind of a happy middle of kind of invisible facilitation where we're not conscious of a facilitator being really scripted or really improvisational. We just kind of go with the flow and are it's really seamless and quite invisible in a good way. I think that's what we're leaning toward. And so that's why, to me, that sort of hardly seen, gentle facilitation that really is responsive in the room is what we're going after.
Sure. That's what, you mentioned about finding a sweet spot between improvisation and orchestration.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what, yeah, fine.
Exactly.
See, you mentioned about 4 Ps in each of the stages in the book. Can you please tell us, why those 4 Ps and why you think those 4 Ps are important?
Yeah, I mean, I find it easier when I'm considering new material and training people. I think it's helpful to have a bit of scaffolding that helps us remember kind of what we're talking about. And so what I did in the book was I looked at different stages of the facilitation journey, the work that happens ahead of time, the work that happens in the room, and the work that happens afterwards. And I find that mostly the preparation work is the most important part. And that's why most of the book talks about that early stage. But inside each of those 3 stages, we talked about people and about purpose. We talked about place and process. And so really thinking about who's in the room, who should be in the room, what difference does it make that they are in the room and not someone else? That kind of element of the combination of humans that are with us, either in the digital space or the in-person space. And then the second P around purpose, I'm a huge fan of facilitators focusing on the objectives of a session, the purpose of a session, and being really flexible about how to get there, but not very flexible about whether or not we will fulfill that purpose. And so having a very clear sense, not just of the overall purpose, but of how each chunk of the day or the session or the workshop aligns with that purpose and what the sort of sub purposes are for each of those pieces. But even the purpose for the stage you're in. So ahead of time, what is the purpose of that planning stage? So for me, part of that is anticipating what is likely to happen or what could happen in the room. Because what I say in Nimble is that there's lots of reasons for things to go off track in a room. I don't want me as the facilitator to be one of those reasons, right? I want to have done as much preparation as I can to offset the need for being nimble in the room, because there will be lots of other reasons that appear without my help. I think one of the other pieces around the P's is place. It seems to me that the venue in which we conduct a session, for example, really affects what happens in it. And so I encourage people to pay attention to place as one of other various sort of levers of control that we have as event planners and facilitators, to be able to say, how can I set things up for success, for creativity, for energy and engagement? And then the final P is around process. And I think this is really what most facilitators tend to focus on and get trained in. And that is kind of how to design the experience for people so that the structured conversation invitations that we are able to offer them as facilitators hang together well, lead us to that purpose, and give us a really well-equipped toolbox to be able to be good guides to the group.
Sure. That's what, you said, in the process, you say script it, but hold it loosely.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's what, we used to say, hold to the process, but not hold on to the process forever. Yeah,
Yes,
something
yes,
like that. Yeah, that's very
absolutely. And
important.
I think what that requires, Ramesh, is it requires having, I think sometimes when we do a lot of preparation, we can kind of fall in love with our design. And
Mm,
we can walk in the room and almost feel disappointed in the group for not following our beloved, beautifully thought out process, and we can kind of get unconsciously frustrated with the group because they aren't following along with what we thought should happen. And
right.
even as I say that out loud, you know, part of me is going, no, I mean, ideally, most facilitators don't want to do that. But I think if we're honest about our own emotional state in a room, we've kind of played through the process lots of times in our heads ahead of time. And I think part of the benefit of that is that it can lead us to be well prepared. But I think a dark side of that is that it can make us too attached to basically an imagined meeting that has not yet happened, right?
Mhm.
And so when the real life meeting happens and doesn't live up to our expectations, we can get disappointed with the people in the room. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense when we think about it. So I think what we want to do is create some scaffolding, some tools, some clarity around objectives, but then develop our responsiveness, our confidence enough to be able to say, now that I've done all that preparation in order to soothe my nerves and nervous system, I can not quite set it aside, but at least, as you've said, I hold it loosely enough that we can still really flex with it when we actually get in the room and have people not feel like they are trying to live up to something they've never even seen.
Great. So can we say, like, use the process more like a scaffolding, but not like elevator?
I like that idea. Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that people need us as facilitators to give them some structure. They don't want to feel like it's just a free for all and there's
Mm,
no kind of order to things or reasons for things. But I also think they don't want to feel suffocated by it or beholden to it, or that there's no room for them to influence what happens in that space. And so trying to find that balance is tricky. And I think for most of us, in anything we're trying to find balance in, it's very rare that we can kind of get that balance right and walk that line exactly. We're usually kind of too far one way, too far the other. And that's why I think having some self-awareness around our preferences and tendencies as a facilitator is a really good idea, because most of us will lean one way or the other just by preference. And
mm,
then when we are stressed, which we will be in the front of a room when the stakes are high, we go even more that way. And so, I think knowing ourselves that way, if you are a really scripted person, you might need to make that very detailed agenda in advance to help yourself feel calm and ready. But you know that your tendency then in the room is that you would be gripping that very tightly and you might need to loosen that grip. Someone
mm,
else might say, oh yeah, when I get nervous, I basically forget to bring my script with me. Like all the preparation flies out of my head and I just stand at the
mm.
front of the room and kind of, wing it. And that person might need to be more disciplined about having some structure to the session, all in the service of the objectives and also of the experience that participants want to have. And that's where that memory for me of not everyone prefers my preference is a good reminder.
Great. And you have incorporated all these four aspects in the three stages of facilitation, like in anticipation, that is preparation, agility in the room, and absorption after the session is over. So we will try to see some of the aspects. See, in anticipation, you are talking about self-awareness and building relational currency. See how well preparing this will help us in the room, Rebecca.
Mm. I think there's two pieces here that have proven to be really helpful to me over time.
Mm,
One is that idea of anticipation that I mentioned. And what I mean by that is not so much accurate prediction of what's going to happen,
mm,
but at least looking at the questions you're going to ask and say, if I ask those questions, what kind of answers am I likely to get? Not that I'm trying to direct the answers, but I'm anticipating the kinds of answers. And then I say,
mm,
well, are those kinds of answers the kinds of answers that are going to lead us to achieving our objectives or lead us to the next activity? Because sometimes people don't link the activities very well because the questions generate answers that take us in a different direction. And it's not so much that I'm trying to predetermine how people answer a question, but imagine if I ask a question that is leaning toward brainstorming and ideation, chances are I'm going to get lots of possible answers, lots of creativity, lots of divergence. If that's what I want, terrific. But if I was hoping that that little segment of my meeting was going to converge us toward a decision, me framing my question as a wide open one is going to all of a sudden go, oh, we've now opened that funnel and created lots of possibilities when in fact we were looking to narrow it. And so that doesn't take accurate prediction. That just takes recognizing what direction a question is likely to take us in. So that anticipation is important. And figuring out that skill of, if I do this activity, what is it likely to lead to? And then you mentioned relational currency. I think that's another piece that's really important, to have candid conversations with your, say in my case, with my client or multiple people who are going to be in the room, so that they can help me understand the dynamic into which I am walking. So whether that's a cultural dynamic or a relational one, or sort of the context in which are given, maybe I'm developing a strategy and I need to understand the backdrop for that strategy. Or maybe there are conversations that this organization has been having over and over again, and they need my help landing them and moving on from them. I need to understand that context. And so some of my planning is involving building those relationships with some of the folks involved, so that I can have some kind of accurate understanding, because my goal is that my own learning curve about an organization or a situation should happen ahead of time more than in the room. So I don't want to slow a group down in the room because of my own lack of familiarity with their acronyms, with their context, with their dynamic. And so I'm trying to do as much of that ahead of time as I can.
Sure, thanks. See, coming to process-related strategy in anticipation, you mentioned about managing the mojo. So, can you just tell us about that?
Yeah, I think a facilitator is the guardian of the energy in a room, and it's interesting because in the years since Nimble was written, I've written more on energy as an important currency for people. Sometimes even more important than their time, or more important than their money. That energy is a currency for people, and it's a gauge for us of how people are doing. Sometimes if we lead a team and you notice that the energy level of your people is really low, that's a proxy measure for some other things that are going on. And so in any given room, if we bring it back to facilitation, we are the guardians and the stewards of that energy. And so we have to bring a certain energy into the space. And we need to monitor how the energy of the group is going, and then also decide what to do once we notice that. So, for example, it doesn't require, I don't have to figure out in the meeting that people, if we work together for a day, I don't have to sort it out in real time that probably after lunch, people's energy is going to be a bit lower than it was in the morning, right? Yeah. We can anticipate that. That is a well-documented pattern in human energy. Daniel Pink talks about it in his book, When. There's lots of places where we know just from lived experience that after lunch is a sleepy time. So if I am in the planning stages, I can anticipate that after lunch is quiet. So as a facilitator and designer, what am I going to do with that quiet? I can either go with it, meaning giving the group a quieter activity. Maybe they're watching a video. Maybe they are doing a reflective journaling exercise. They're doing something a little bit mellow. Right. Or we're doing something really high energy to offset that low energy moment, right? So we're out for we're doing a scavenger hunt. We're doing an active role play. We're really doing activities that are going to boost the energy. What we are not doing is being oblivious to the fact that that's a low energy time. We're being intentional about managing that energy. And similarly, I need to manage my own energy. And so, for example, if I'm in the midst of a really intense moment in a room where I'm trying to figure out where to go from here, if we take a break, coffee break or something to reset the room, I need to make sure that I take that break too. So sometimes I need that break to literally move things around in the room and reset it. But sometimes I need to go and hide, because what happens is sometimes the participants are coming and chatting with me about things which I love. But in that moment, I need to recharge my battery. So sometimes I do go remove myself from the room just for 5 or 10 minutes to, to reset my brain enough that I'm not getting distracted by small talk with participants, and haven't used that time to reset my own brain for what's needed next. And so I think we've got this joint responsibility to manage our own mojo as a facilitator, but also to pay attention to how the group is doing in that way. And a lot of that happens in the planning stage. I think sometimes people think it's in the room, and it plays out in the room, but it's planned for in the planning.
Right. Sure. And it's also about balancing, right? Because there could be certain occasions where we may like to get engaged with the participants for getting some input or to get a feel or something like that. So in that time, you strike a balance. You decide, right? That's how it goes.
Absolutely. But that's part of being nimble too. Sometimes I need to chat with some people in the room for the purpose of the session, to say to the sponsor or the client, how do you feel this is going? Or do we need to change direction here? Or I'm noticing a dynamic I don't completely understand. That kind of check-in, I think, is really helpful.
Sure. And see, as we are not talking about the particular time in a day, does that logic also hold good for which day of the week you are holding the session, Rebecca?
Yeah, that's
Because most of the retreats happen during the weekends. So
Yeah.
do you find any pattern like sessions happening during the beginning of the week is more energetic than the sessions happening at the end of the week? Is there some pattern?
Certainly what I notice is that I do a lot of work with volunteer boards, and for most of those folks, they are doing a paid work job during the day, and so they can meet for the board retreat or board meeting either in the evening or on the weekends. And so I'm conscious of those evening meetings. People are tired. They have already put in a full day at work. Maybe they've rushed home to make dinner for their family, and now they're coming out again for this meeting. And so I'm conscious of trying to keep those meetings, not running too long and moving really well. If we're meeting on a Saturday, for example, I'm very aware of what else people could be doing on that day. For me, Saturdays are very precious days with my family. And so if I have been asked to come to a meeting as a volunteer, for example, on a Saturday, it better be so good. And also, because we are now in a stage where we could do most meetings digitally a lot of the time, if we are asking people to come to an in-person meeting, they have managed, traffic and childcare and all kinds of other things to get there. I want to make it so much better than something we could do on Zoom, for example. I want to make it worth their effort coming, because I don't want them to leave saying, that was fine, but we could have just logged into a call and had it be equally good. I think we need to really pay attention now. And Nimble, the book, doesn't talk about this that much because it was written before COVID. But I feel like our experiences of COVID have really, at least for me, they've really upped my game in terms of my ability as a facilitator to facilitate digitally or hybrid or in person. And not just to facilitate in those spaces, but to judge whether we should be in which format and what kinds of considerations go into that. So certainly, if we're leading a session on a Friday afternoon, it's very different than if it's on a Tuesday morning. And I think the length of the session matters too. If we are together for several days, it's very different than if we're together for 2 hours, right? So you're trying to get the pace right for a lot of different altitudes there.
Great. So now, moving on to being agile in the room, you have written about, being very deliberately attentive about oneself as well as others in the room by using, the concept of fuel and focus. So can you kindly explain that concept, Rebecca?
Yeah,
Fuel, focus.
fuel and focus. Fuel goes back for me to energy, right? And giving people not just energy, but whatever other resources they need to be able to answer a particular question or do a particular activity, while also encouraging them to direct their attention in particular ways. When I think about I do a lot of strategy building. And part of what I like about strategy is that the reason we do it is to help a group focus its attention, maybe in a corporation or something, focus its attention on a few important priorities. And what you're doing by inference is you're saying, therefore, please don't focus your attention on these other things, or don't let your attention sort of leak all over the place. And I think the same is true in a facilitated meeting, where we as the facilitator are guiding the group to please focus on this piece of the story right now, or on this activity, and here's why. And so we're giving people kind of the energy and resources and information and context that they need to participate, but we're also saying we're going to do it in this way for this length of time using this activity. And all of that is kind of look, the group goes here, and we're really trying to get people's attention sort of in one place at a time so that we can gradually build toward those objectives.
Okay, great. See, and in terms of wherever the group is getting stuck, we are given some 18 pointers for facilitators to handle that. But the other challenge what we generally face is handling difficult participants, Rebecca. As you rightly said, like there are some hijackers, there are some deserters. So how to manage that? Of course, you are given some 12 suggestions in the book. So if you can share your insights, that will be great on this managing the difficult participants, deserters and hijackers.
I think I feel like my thinking is evolving in this area. And I think one of the ways that it's evolving is to say difficult for whom. And so one of the self-awareness pieces that I think is important for us to bring into the space is to say there will be certain behaviors in a room that I, as an individual, unique human, find particularly irritating, right? There's, where somebody else might not find that particular behavior problematic, but they might find something else annoying. And so part of it is difficult for whom, because if I'm holding very tightly to my script and someone is deviating from that script, I might find that behavior difficult, and yet somebody else might not find that difficult. They might say, yes, that's brilliant, because that's exactly where we need to go right now. So internally, I'm going, oh, that's not where I wanted to go. But someone else might be saying, very smart, we need to go there. And so recognizing, first of all, difficult for whom, I think is one piece of handling those participants. I think another element is remembering that, particularly when we are new facilitators, our fear of difficult participants probably far outweighs the likelihood that that's going to happen. And so just recognizing that, although this is important to talk about, and I will give some strategies for it, most of the time, at least in my contexts, people are lovely. They do as they're asked, they're friendly, they are focused, they are on task, and they, play along, right? So the likelihood of this happening is low. Having said that, I'm a fan of the idea that good structure and good process offsets the need for bad behavior in a room. And so if a meeting is being well run, if people feel like they are being heard, that they're able to use their own words, that they have meaningful opportunities to participate, that the reason we're doing each activity makes some sense, all of that allows them to calm down and feel that they are in capable hands with the facilitator. They are much less likely to behave badly in whatever way that looks in whatever culture you're in, than if they feel like things are out of control or purposeless, or, in getting edited on their behalf, or they. So I think encouragement for people, in addition to saying probably won't happen as much as you fear, is to say good solid facilitation will lower the. Having said that, if we are in a situation where some behaviors are starting to detract from the group's ability to get its work done, I would say there's two things that I try to keep in mind. One is to intervene early, like to notice that things are starting to go in that direction, name it, address it. Don't just sort of hope it goes away. So I think being like on top of it early is helpful before it becomes a big deal. And related to that, and very important, they go together, is to intervene as the facilitator proportionately to the behavior that's happening. So if someone is doing something that is a little bit irritating or a little bit distracting, as a facilitator, I may choose to ignore it, but I may choose to address it. But I don't want to address it, in a really extreme hey, put that phone away, kind of thing. It would be really disproportionate to what's happening. If we've asked participants not to be on their phones and someone's on their phone, to me, that's a small thing. And I go, okay, small but not nothing. I do want them to put their phone away because we've asked for that to be a norm in the group. But I'm going to give them a moment, right? They're grown-ups. They probably have something they have to do. I'm going to give them a sec. If they still are on their phone, I might physically, if I'm in the room with them, I might physically move my body nearby. Like I might just stand closer to them, won't say anything, won't make any eye contact, just move physically nearer them. Chances are they'll put their phone away. That seems to me to be a much more appropriate response than me, drawing attention to them, speaking sharply to them, making a really big deal out of something that needs to be attended to because it is the participants, it's the facilitator's job to reinforce the agreements that we've made together. But if something really potentially harmful or unsafe or offensive happens in the space, I'm going to respond to that in a much more direct, non-negotiable, clear way. I'm not just going to go stand near the person. I'm actually going to say something. And so, because I think part of our responsibility is to maintain as much safety in the room as we can reasonably be held accountable for. And so if that is being compromised, I'm going to step in quickly on that. And so I think there's a range of responses appropriate to a situation, but what I would say is get ahead of it and respond proportionally to it.
So it's more like, different strokes for different folks. Our approach should be that.
I think so. But I think realizing as the facilitator, what your responsibility is, so that we're not just letting it go or letting, even trying to realize which conflicts need to be handled in the room and which ones need to be handled outside. Because sometimes what happens is people in an existing team, for example, might have some history with each other that they're bringing into the room. And, so there are times where I might ask the group or ask those people if the conversation that they are starting between the two of them in front of everybody, is this a conversation for everyone to be involved in, everyone to hear, or is this a conversation that they need to have outside of this space? And if it is for them to have outside of the space, I might say, do you need to have it right now? In which case, excuse yourselves and go have it, or can it wait till later? So part of it is figuring out whether the dynamic in the room needs to actually stay in the room or is for the room or not.
Sure. So it's very important, as a facilitator, to not only focus on divergence and convergence, equally important to focus on the emergence in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the way you're describing that.
Sure. Thanks. See, and when it comes to the third stage, you talk about absorption. You've written a lot about self-compassion as an important aspect in absorption. Can you please, elaborate that? And I also like the Nancy Watts phrase, editor, you mentioned there. Like, be kind to yourself. So that's very good, Rebecca. Can you please explain, why self-compassion is important?
Yeah. So this final phase is the afterwards. And often as facilitators, we don't really think about it. We think about what goes on in the room. We might think about what goes on in advance, but this piece of the book that you're referring to, the absorption phase, is what happens after. And it's important to end a session well and to follow up well with your participants. But I think there's also an element of following up well, in a sense, with ourselves and attending to how we're doing afterwards. And what can happen is, especially when we are hard on ourselves, which is that idea of having that critical voice in our head that Nancy calls the head editor, we can be a much harsher critic of ourselves than other people would be of us. And so there's that dynamic. And then I think the other dynamic is that we know what we hoped would happen in the room. And we compare that to what actually did happen in the room. And we might feel like it's not measuring up, and therefore we are critical of ourselves in that. But remember that the participants don't know what we thought would happen in the room. And in fact, what we thought would happen in the room doesn't matter. It didn't happen. That was entirely imaginary. What matters is what happened in the room. And so I think if we are benchmarking against what we wanted to happen or what we thought would happen or what we had scripted ahead of time to happen, isn't that helpful. And then the third piece, I think, is the when we are assessing this, because sometimes, it's 4:30 in the afternoon and we've been facilitating for 2 straight days and we are tired and hungry and we're about to embark on, heavy traffic to get home to a busy family. That's probably not our best moment to start criticizing ourselves for all the things we wish we had done or not done, or decisions we made in the moment in the room. And so I think that self-compassion you mentioned comes from recognizing those 3 things: our tendency to be negative anyway, our tendency to measure against an impossibly high standard, and our tendency to do so when we're tired and hungry. All of that says to me, probably not our best moment to decide how the meeting went. And so some of the antidotes to that are making sure that we're checking in with other people. So for example, the client, did they feel that the objectives got met? Did the participants have a good experience? Did the activities that actually happened in the room lead us to where we needed to go, even though it was not the route I thought we would take to get there? Am I willing to come back and kind of reflect on this, maybe with a thinking partner or a coach or a mentor, a day or 2 later rather than right then? Those kinds of habits. And the other thing that I find very helpful afterwards as a learning discipline, and I'm not as good at doing this as I'd like to be, but I still like the idea, I'm trying. And that is that we plan an agenda or facilitation plan that we might, save on our computer someplace. What I think is a good idea is to go back after a meeting and tweak that plan to reflect what actually happened. Because if we have to go and do a similar meeting again another time with that client or with somebody else, I want to make sure in my file I have not only what I planned to do, but what actually happened. Because then I can plan based on actuals, not plan based on imaginary anticipation the next time. And so, others will be very much more disciplined than I am in terms of good record keeping. It's not my best skill, but if I can go back and make some notes to myself about what I actually did and how that went, that'll be a better tool for me to refer back to later.
Sure. Yeah, great. So, and you were also telling about the importance of ending the session well and reflection. See, I also recall in fact, it may look bit simple. You said don't leave the room in a hurry. Don't tell others you are in a hurry to leave. Be there. People may like to come and talk to you. May like to have some chat with you. That you said in both ways. Like one is the relationship building. Second, it also makes business sense. We may get some new clients, who knows, with that small talk.
Yeah.
So that how would you elaborate that, nice ending and reflection?
Yeah. Our brains remember endings disproportionately. And so if a session ends poorly or just kind of fizzles out, it's not the same powerful ending as if we have a clear, thoughtful ending. Sometimes in some contexts, if you're at a retreat or something like that, sometimes it's done through ritual. Sometimes it's something like a gratitude circle or something like that. Other times it's, sort of an action plan and a recap. Or sometimes there's awards given or something. There's all kinds of ways to do it. I do find this the hardest part of a session to plan well, because I'm usually tired. I'm not personally usually a fan of particular kinds of, I don't want it to be awkward. I don't want it to feel forced. I don't want it to feel sort of cheesy. And so trying to find a good way to end, I do find a little bit challenging. So let me give you an example from just yesterday. I was facilitating a session, and what I did, it was sort of a training session in facilitation. And so what I did, we had a group of about 12 or 15 people, and I had about 15 minutes left. And so what I did was I went around the room and I said, okay, there's 15 of you. I'd love it if you took less than 1 minute each to tell us one thing that you think you're going to apply from this session in the next 2 weeks. Because we know if we're learning something new, that if we apply it quickly, we're more likely to grow roots. It's more likely to get rooted in us, right? So yes. I literally went around the room very quickly and, what's something you're going to try in the next 2 weeks? And we went around and they stayed with the time. I was very explicit about, 30 seconds-ish. And some said the same things as each other. Some said different things. And that took us to about 3 or 4 minutes left. And I said, hey, thank you so much for giving us a recap of the highlights of today. So it didn't need me to recap it. I recapped it based on their takeaways. And then I said, and my last facilitation tip for you is always end a meeting early if you can. And we had, 2 minutes left at that point, and, they gave me a round of applause, and that was the end. And so it doesn't have to be, candles and woo-woo if that's not the group, right? It can be something very sort of focused and analytical of what's your one takeaway. But it kind of felt like we tied a bit of a bow on it. And it wasn't just like me looking at the clock going, oh my goodness, we should finish, And so I do think that ending clearly and well is a helpful thing, and not just letting people kind of wander away. And then picking up on what you said, I do think the idea of not rushing off is helpful, because almost always people will come and continue the conversation. They might have some questions. And so often what I will do, even on a digital meeting, is I will say, I can hang around for another 15 minutes if you have something you'd like to chat about. And so I give it a bit of an end, so that I'm not there for an hour if I have a plane to catch, but I'm not rushing off either. And I'm saying, I'm framing it in a way that feels, I hope, generous, but also gives them an idea of, if there's 5 people waiting to talk to me and I wanted to stay for 15 minutes, you've got about 3 minutes, not 30,
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
just trying to signal to people what kind of the helpful behavior is in that context.
Right. So in the way, all is well that ends well. So
Yeah, we remember endings, and so you want to really pay attention to it.
Sure, great. Yeah, and finally, you are also a AQ coach, adaptability quotient coach, Rebecca. See, how do you think the AQ adaptability quotient will come handy to a facilitator?
So the concept of Nimble as a book, as I mentioned, came out of a desire to be nimble in the room as a facilitator, but it soon after its publication became a more important kind of concept for life, right? I mean, as everything changed in the world, we became much more aware globally of the need to be adaptable. And so over the course of that time, I became aware of this measurement tool called adaptability quotient. And what it does is it measures the adaptability skill set of individuals and teams. And I really loved it because it was so aligned with that brand that I'm interested in. But it also, I love it because it builds our environment, our collective experience of our team and our corporation right into our individual scores and adaptability. So it's not like it takes your score and my other team member score and compiles them afterwards to say, oh, this is how adaptable your team is.
Yeah.
It recognizes that our team experiences, our physical environments, our immediate team, our corporate culture, those things actually affect my individual ability to adapt as an individual too. And it integrates it really well. So how is it that I can use that tool? I don't necessarily, I think it's helpful for any facilitator, but I think the reason I like it for anybody is that it gives us some data about our preferred ways of adapting. So I don't think we have a choice about whether we adapt or not. I think that choice is off the table. We need to adapt in a variety of settings for a variety of reasons. The tool helps us with some evidence-informed pathways to adapt in the ways that suit us best. So the tool is made up of 15 subdimensions that can combine in like 1.3 trillion ways, literally, in any given person to say, you are strong in these skills and a little weaker in these other areas. So what I would say as a coach is let's lean into those strong areas, because those are the areas that you're going to prefer to adapt.
Right.
You're going to find that tool easiest. So if you're somebody that has really strong mental flexibility, for example, you can see lots of ways to solve a problem. Let's use that to help you adapt, rather than if you're lower in grit or stamina, I'm not going to ask you to persist for months on something. I'm going to keep the assignment short, but I'm going to help you see lots of ways. And so when I think about that in facilitation, if I have that mental flexibility skill, I can see lots of ways in a room to help a group get somewhere. But if I have a low grit score, I'm going to say, I really am going to try to keep my sessions short and not do multi-day facilitated retreats that are going to sap my energy. So it's really another self-awareness tool and team awareness tool to help you say, what's my preferred tool to use or mixture of tools to use to adapt? If I'm a carpenter, I want to use a hammer and a saw and some nails. I don't want to use artist's paintbrushes or knitting needles to do my job. But if I'm a knitter, I'm going to use those knitting needles to adapt. I don't have a choice about adapting, but I do have a choice which tools I use to get there.
Right. Great. And we can not talk a lot about this book. It has got a lot of depth about it, but paucity of time and also all good things had to come to an end. So thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for this insight about the being nimble. And one thing I also liked about the book is you also said by practicing all the steps that you have prescribed in the book, you will reduce the need to be nimble in the room, right? That is the basic objective you said. Once you do all these things, your need to be nimble in the room will be very less. That's a good way to approach to a book. And thanks very much, Rebecca, for this. Thanks for your time. We really treasure it.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation. And if anybody is interested in following up with any of this, they're welcome to look at RebeccaSutherns.com. There's lots of different options there in terms of ways to find the book and other resources in the free resources section, for example, book clubs that I run, things like that can help people go deeper if they're interested.
Sure. Yeah, of course, our website is a treasure trove. I could go through it. A lot of information you have given there. And this book, Nimble, it's not only for facilitator, Rebecca. What I thought is, it's for any leader. Leaders have to hold meetings. So being nimble is important to them also, not only facilitator. Why only to facilitation? So I would then recommend this book to all the leaders who want to hold effective conversations and meetings.
Thanks very much, Ramesh. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.